Hello and welcome to this Hare Court Employment Team bite-sized seminar. We're going to be looking at discrimination today in the context of employment, and particularly what issues are going to be thrown up by the pandemic. And one of the first questions I wanted to address, because I don't think a lot of people have thought about it, could having COVID-19 amount to a disability under the Equality Act? What are your thoughts, Emily?
Well, Sara, we know that under the Equality Act, a disability has an actual or likely duration of 12 months. Now, the World Health Organization confirmed the first official case of COVID outside China on the 13th of January 2020. So although we're not quite at the stage, we're not at the stage of 12 months on until obviously January next year, what we do know is that many of those affected are suffering ongoing symptoms such as fatigue and respiratory issues that may in fact last for 12 months or longer.
But I think for the majority of discrimination cases we're going to be looking at, it's going to be those who already have existing protected characteristics under the Equality Act.
Yeah, and I think in that regard, clearly we look at the government guidance that was issued in May, which separated out clinically extremely vulnerable people and clinically vulnerable people. And I think in some respects, it's much more straightforward for employers when dealing with the extremely vulnerable category, as these are the people who ought to be shielding and cannot return to the workplace at the moment.
So that's quite easy if you're an employer or an employee. There's probably going to be a consensus around the fact that there's no question about you returning to work. You should be working remotely if that's possible, or potentially you probably will have been furloughed.
Exactly, Sara. So I think where the difficulty will arise is in relation to the clinically vulnerable people, who include those over the age of 70, those with certain health conditions such as respiratory diseases, and also pregnant women. Because the guidance in this regard, and I think this is something that you mentioned, Sara, it is much more opaque. So there's no requirement to shield for these people, but they are advised, and I'm quoting directly here from the guidance, to stay at home as much as possible. And if they do go out, to take particular care to minimise contact with others outside their household or support bubble. And I don't know about you, Sara, but I think that's slightly vague.
It is vague, and I think that probably means they're not going to be prevented from returning to work. So if you're an employer, we're coming into a period, namely July, where we have a flexible furlough. So you're going to be able to have some of your employees and workers back on a part-time basis, so they don't have to be working full-time. So you're slowly starting to gear your business up. And I think that there are some really important questions you need to be asking yourself. So Chartered Institute of Personal Development put together a very important kind of set of 3 questions, if you like. Is it necessary for that person to be back at work? Is it safe for them to be back at work? And is it agreed? And I think that's going to crop up in a lot of discussion with employment law at the moment. Can you agree it between employer and employee?
Absolutely, and there's the very important consideration of dealing with safety in the workplace. I think it's quite an obvious point that as an employer, your obligation to carry out a risk assessment requires you to take account of those with protected characteristics, and that includes obviously pregnant workers and the disabled. So the Commission for Equality and Human Rights has reminded employers to undertake a risk assessment for pregnant workers and new mothers, accounting for the requirements of their job and the use of public transport. And in the case of disabled workers, obviously you have a duty under the Equality Act to make reasonable adjustments, and that includes the provision of physical equipment or other aids.
And one common misapprehension that you and I see, Emily, is people think if you're working from home, you don't always have to do a risk assessment, and that's clearly not correct. But we've also discussed things like lone working. You're going to find some people who are more stressed at working remotely, they don't have access to supervision and support they normally would have. So individuals who may not have had a protected characteristic under the Equality Act may actually, in fact, become disabled due to an exacerbation of a mental health condition or the start of a mental health condition that could be a disability. And then, as you and I were discussing in the flexible working series, you can have very, very bad chairs, working environments, all sorts of things that exacerbate physical injuries as well. And that could bring somebody into the Equality Act as somebody who's got the protected characteristic of disability.
Absolutely, and as well as the problems within the home, I think we've also got to be thinking about the journey to work as well, which can be particularly problematic for those who are returning to work. So if public transport is the only way for them to travel to and from work, employers might want to start thinking about practical solutions to help those employees. So considering whether they can stagger start and leave times and offering potentially alternative transport.
And there's going to be a different attitude between different groups. So if you're over 70, you're extremely clinically vulnerable. But we do know that if you are above, say, 50 and increasingly above 60 or 65, you're far more likely to be susceptible to COVID-19 infection. So we need to be careful that there aren't going to be age discrimination points or potential victimisation, harassment, all sorts of things occurring as a result of the different attitudes of different cohorts of people.
Absolutely, and I think that there has to be a very strong emphasis on the need to really communicate with your workers. So if any decisions in this kind of field are made rashly or without proper consultation, it's important to be aware that those decisions could lead to employment tribunal claims further down the line. So we touched on the physical disabilities. What about sort of thinking about mental health and that kind of side of things?
Well, I think your communication point's so important, because just because somebody wasn't disabled, they didn't have a protected characteristic at the start of lockdown, you may find the situation has changed. I think you were reminding me of a statistic from the health charity Mind this morning. I believe they've come up with some data about mental health.
Yes, I think it's a statistic that is quite widely reported now. I think many people will be aware that apparently 1 in 4 people in the UK will have a mental health problem at some point.
So I think if we move on to the point that there can be a misconception that if individuals are working from home, they cannot be discriminated against. I mean, can you think of examples that may not be correct?
Yeah, so the most obvious one that springs to mind is through sort of communication. So whether that's verbal communication or written communication, that could amount to either indirect discrimination or harassment. So potentially an employer could be liable for harassment or discrimination unless they've taken the proper steps to prevent the conduct. And it's important to note that it won't be sufficient to simply rely on the existence of a policy. Employers will need evidence of training and combating inappropriate behaviour. So I think it's important to think about how HR is operating to ensure that there's proper access to grievance and complaints procedures during the lockdown.
And I think I wanted to end talking about race. I think we're in the middle, not just of a pandemic, but a massive social change when it comes to Black Lives Matter. And I think any employees ought to be thinking about that. How can they be better around race? We know with COVID, greater risk of infections, unfortunately, in the BAME population. With COVID again, we've seen people of Chinese or Asian heritage who've been targeted. So don't allow race to fall off the agenda. It very much is going to be important, I think, not just for this pandemic, but moving forward.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks very much, Sara. I think that probably concludes this short talk, unless you have any further points to add.
No, thanks.
Thanks, Sara.